My name is Bishop Dale C. Bronner, and I welcome you to a sacred space where truth speaks louder than trends, where your spirit gets fed, not just your feelings. You were never designed to be fulfilled by temporary things. Eternity is coded in your DNA. In this channel, we dig deep, because real satisfaction doesn't come when you get more, it comes when you surrender deeper. There's a purpose pulling on your soul, and it's time to align. God's timing is not delayed, it's divine. These messages are not just for your ears, they're for your destiny. We don't just motivate, we equip. We don't just speak, we build you in the spirit. So if you're hungry for depth, thirsty for truth, and ready to walk in power, you're in the right place. You can feed your desires and still starve your soul, because only God satisfies the deepest hunger of the heart. You see, we live in a time where everything is accessible, yet fulfillment is elusive. We're surrounded by abundance, but still aching with a quiet emptiness that no achievement, no relationship, no experience can silence. There's a reason for that. Desires are not wrong, God gave them to us. But when desires become the destination instead of a signal to something greater, we begin to live in cycles of satisfaction and frustration. You may satisfy your flesh for a moment, but your soul will still cry out when what you've consumed can't sustain what you're truly lacking. Our souls are not designed to be fed by temporary things, they're eternal. And when we try to feed an eternal soul with earthly pleasures, it's like trying to water a garden with smoke. It looks like something's happening, but nothing grows. You'll wake up from the high. You'll come down from the thrill. You'll realize the applause didn't fix the ache, because fulfillment doesn't come from having more. It comes from connecting deeper. Some of us are tired and don't even know why. We've been chasing what culture calls success, and still feel like something is missing. It's not that you haven't reached the goal, it's that the goal wasn't what your spirit needed. You can win in the eyes of people and still lose peace in the depths of your own heart. That's what happens when the soul is overlooked. That's what happens when we feed the flesh and ignore the spirit. Desire is a signal, not a solution. Every craving is a clue. That hunger you feel, that longing that keeps showing up even when life is good on paper. That's your spirit reminding you that you are made for more than what this world can offer. That's eternity whispering, come closer. You see, when we seek God, when we surrender to His presence, He doesn't just meet us, He fills us. He fills the gaps that achievement can't touch. He pours peace into places money can't reach. He heals wounds that time hasn't managed to mend. Sometimes the reason we feel so heavy is not because we're holding too much, but because we're missing the one thing that makes everything else make sense, the presence of God. You can hustle, you can grind, you can build an empire, but without His presence, you'll feel empty at the top. Because no amount of elevation can replace revelation. And when God reveals to you what your soul is actually starving for, you'll stop running to things that only make you hungrier. Some of us are feeding our lives on junk food for the spirit. Things that entertain but don't enrich. Things that stimulate but don't sustain. You scroll for hours and you laugh for a moment, but then you put the phone down and still feel alone, because laughter without depth fades fast. Distraction isn't healing, it's just delay, and God is not in the business of giving you distractions. He wants to give you direction. He's not after surface solutions, He's after transformation. Because when God satisfies, it's not temporary. It's not shallow, it's not performance-based. He satisfies from the inside out. The kind of satisfaction that lets you walk through storms and still have peace. The kind of fulfillment that doesn't need constant validation. The kind of joy that doesn't depend on your bank account, your title, or your likes. That's why Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. That wasn't just a metaphor, that was a truth. It's a call to come out of the cycles that leave you dry. It's a call to stop feeding what only keeps you needing more, because the enemy will always offer you things that look like fulfillment but function like chains. It's sugar for the soul, sweet at first, but it leaves you weaker, not stronger. That's not God's plan for you. God wants to satisfy you deeply, not just momentarily. He wants to anchor your joy in something unshakable. And that begins when you stop treating your soul like a side dish, when you stop trying to fix a spiritual need with a natural solution, when you start asking not just what do I want, but what does my spirit need? Because the truth is, what we truly crave beneath the surface of all our desires is Him. And when you start feeding your soul the Word of God, when you start soaking in His presence instead of just scrolling through your problems, something shifts. You begin to feel light again. Hope begins to rise again. Peace begins to settle in places where confusion once ruled. You no longer chase fulfillment, it starts flowing through you. Not because life got easier, but because you're now living from the inside out. There is a difference between existing and living, and you don't really start living until you're living in alignment with your Creator. That's when the soul is full. That's when the heart is satisfied. That's when the noise doesn't drown your purpose, and the chaos can't cancel your clarity. Because when God fills you, it's not seasonal, it's sustaining. So if you've been feeling empty, maybe it's not because you need more, maybe it's because you've missed what truly matters. Go back to the well that never runs dry. Return to the presence that restores, because only God satisfies the deepest hunger of the heart. And when He fills you, nothing else will ever compare. When the noise of the world fails to fill the silence inside you, that's when God whispers your true identity. We're surrounded by sound, constant, relentless sound, the opinions of others, the pull of expectations, the distractions of culture, the never-ending demands that tell us who to be, what to do, and how to feel. And yet, with all that noise, how many of us are still haunted by silence on the inside? We smile in public but wrestle in private. We're loud on the outside but lost on the inside. That's because no matter how loud the world gets, it can't drown out the aching questions that echo in the soul. Who am I? Why am I here? What's my worth? We've confused volume with value. We think the louder the applause, the deeper the affirmation. But real identity isn't found in the noise, it's discovered in the stillness. God doesn't shout to compete with your chaos. He waits for the moment when your soul is quiet enough to hear Him say who you really are. Because it's not until the outside noise fades that you start to realize the world can label you, but only God can name you. You can spend your whole life trying to live up to what people call you and still never walk in what God named you. There's a difference. The world calls you by what it sees, your mistakes, your reputation, your resume. But God calls you by what He placed in you: purpose, promise, potential. He knew you before you had a name, before you had a title, before you ever failed or succeeded. And it's in the quiet, not the crowd, where you're reminded of that truth. Because the world rewards performance, but God reveals identity. Sometimes we keep the noise turned up because we're afraid of what the silence might say. We don't want to face the inner emptiness, the broken places, the unresolved pain. So we distract ourselves with activity, with approval, with ambition. But the danger in drowning out the silence is that we also silence the whisper of God, that still, small voice that tells you, you are loved. You are chosen, you are mine. There is something sacred about stillness. It's in the quiet where God begins to rebuild what life has worn down. It's in the quiet where He heals the parts of you that the world didn't even know were hurting. It's in the quiet where He begins to remind you of the things you forgot while you were busy being who everyone else needed you to be. Because you can be successful and still be disconnected. You can be celebrated and still be confused. You can be popular and still be perishing inside. But when God speaks, it brings alignment, it brings clarity, it brings life. You weren't created to be defined by trends or trapped by trauma. You were created in the image of the Almighty. There's a signature of heaven stamped on your soul, but you won't discover that in the applause. You'll discover it in the presence of the one who made you. That's why Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. Because identity isn't built in noise, it's restored in intimacy. In those private moments, God reminds you, you are not what they did to you. You are not your last mistake. You are not what didn't work. You are not forgotten. You are not too far gone. We chase recognition, but what we need is revelation. Because when God reveals who you are, it breaks every false identity off your life. You stop living for approval and start living from assurance. You stop comparing and start walking confidently in your lane. You stop striving and start trusting. And it all happens when you give God space to speak. That's why the enemy works overtime to keep your life noisy. Because if you ever get quiet long enough to hear God speak, you'll stop falling for the lies that have kept you bound. The truth is, there's a version of you that you haven't even met yet. The one that emerges when you stop listening to the world and start listening to the Word. The one that's free from the fear of failure. The one that's bold enough to step out in faith. The one that knows you don't need to prove anything because you're already accepted in the Beloved. But that version of you only rises when the noise dies down and the Spirit of God is given room to speak. Don't be afraid of the silence. It's not empty, it's full of answers. Don't resist the quiet. It's where transformation begins. That space where you're not performing, not impressing, not striving. Just present. Just still, that's the place where God speaks the loudest. And He doesn't just speak to inform you. He speaks to form you, to shape you, to strengthen you, to send you out with a clear sense of who you are, whose you are, and what you were born to do. There's something powerful that happens when you stop running to noise for validation and start running to God for confirmation. He confirms what the world never could. He reminds you of the call, the destiny, the assignment. And once you've heard God's voice concerning who you are, the enemy's lies lose their power. You won't be shaken by criticism. You won't be addicted to praise. You'll be rooted, grounded, anchored in the unchanging truth of your identity in Christ. Because when the world goes silent and all the distractions fade, God doesn't disappear. He draws closer, and in that sacred stillness He speaks, not in condemnation, but in calling, not in shame, but in sonship. Not to remind you of who you were, but to declare who you are. That's when the healing begins. That's when the purpose awakens. That's when you stop surviving and start living. And it all starts with a whisper. Because when God whispers your true identity, the noise of the world can no longer control your destiny. What you're chasing may bring moments of pleasure, but only God's presence brings lasting peace. We live in a generation that knows how to chase. We chase status. We chase success. We chase relationships, money, recognition, likes, attention. Anything that gives us a momentary hit of validation. But the truth is, chasing doesn't always lead to contentment. Sometimes it just leaves you exhausted, because no matter how fast you run or how much you gather, if God's not in it, peace won't follow it. Pleasure fades, excitement wears off, achievements grow old. But the presence of God, that stays, that keeps, that satisfies in a way nothing else can. There's nothing wrong with ambition. There's nothing wrong with setting goals and desiring more for your life. But the danger comes when we mistake pleasure for peace, when we settle for the thrill of a moment instead of the security of the presence. You can have a full schedule and an empty soul. You can be surrounded by people and still feel alone. Because the chase may bring a temporary escape, but it can't offer eternal fulfillment. Peace doesn't come from what's happening around you. It comes from what's happening within you. The world teaches us to chase after things that shine. But everything that glitters is not gold, and everything that excites the flesh doesn't nourish the spirit. You might gain everything on the outside and lose yourself on the inside. Jesus asked a question that echoes through every generation. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? That question isn't just about eternity. It's about how we live now. You can gain the whole world and still lose your mind. You can be applauded publicly and tormented privately, because pleasure without peace is still pain wearing a mask. So many people are tired, not because they're working too hard, but because they're chasing things that don't satisfy. You're running after love that's not rooted in God. You're pursuing opportunities that don't align with your purpose. You're seeking validation from people who don't even know who they are. And each time you think you've caught what you're craving, it slips through your fingers like sand. That's because you're not hungry for more things. You're hungry for more of Him. God's presence is not just a Sunday experience. It's not a temporary escape from your problems. It's the home your soul has always longed for. His peace is not based on the absence of problems, but the assurance of His presence. When God is with you, you can walk through the valley and fear no evil. When His peace surrounds you, chaos can rage outside, but you'll have stillness inside. That's the kind of peace the world can't offer and the enemy can't steal. The enemy would love nothing more than to keep you chasing, because as long as you're chasing what doesn't fulfill, you'll never discover what truly does. He'll use distractions that look like blessings, opportunities that pull you out of alignment, relationships that feel good but leave you drained. The enemy doesn't always come dressed as a threat. Sometimes he comes dressed as everything you thought you wanted. And before you know it, you're chasing the very thing that's pulling you away from your peace. But there is a difference between what feels good and what is good. There is a difference between what pleases your flesh and what feeds your spirit. God's presence doesn't always give you what you want, but it gives you what you need. He gives rest to the restless. He gives clarity to the confused. He gives strength to the weary. And above all, He gives peace that passes all understanding. Pleasure can lift your mood, but it can't lift your burdens. Only God can do that. He doesn't just comfort you. He transforms you. He doesn't just bless you. He builds you. And when you've tasted the peace that comes from abiding in His presence, you'll stop being satisfied with shallow moments and start longing for deeper intimacy. You'll stop chasing what's popular and start chasing what's pure. You'll stop measuring success by what you've collected and start measuring it by how closely you're walking with the one who made you. There's a reason why some of us can't sleep at night. There's a reason why even when things are going well, something still feels off. That's your spirit reminding you that no amount of outer comfort can calm inner conflict. That's your soul crying out for the only one who can restore it. It's not about changing your environment. It's about entering His presence. Because one moment in the presence of God can do what years of chasing never could. God's peace is not passive, it's powerful. It protects your mind, it guards your heart, it silences the lies, it stabilizes your emotion. It shifts your perspective. When you carry His presence, you don't react the same way, you don't panic like you used to, you don't depend on others to complete you, you walk in a peace that is rooted in the confidence of who He is and who you are in Him. That kind of peace makes you unshakable. And here's the beautiful truth. You don't have to chase peace, it's already been given. Jesus said, "My peace I give you, not as the world gives. It's yours, but you have to receive it. You have to make room for it. You have to choose it over the fleeting pleasure that promises much and delivers little. Because peace doesn't scream for attention. It waits in the stillness. It waits in surrender. It waits in the quiet places of your heart where God is calling you back, not to performance, not to perfection, but to presence. So if you're tired of the chase, if you're worn out by the cycle of pleasure that never lasts, maybe it's time to return to the presence that never leaves. Maybe it's time to stop running and start resting, not in what you've achieved, but in who He is. Because when you've been with Him, really been with Him, the things you used to chase start chasing you. Peace begins to overflow. Joy becomes your foundation, and you stop living from pressure and start living from presence. Because what you're chasing may bring moments of pleasure, but only God's presence brings lasting peace. Emptiness is not your enemy, it's the echo of your spirit calling you back to divine purpose. We've been taught to fear emptiness, to fill every quiet space, numb every ache, avoid every moment of stillness as if emptiness were the enemy. But what if that hollow feeling inside isn't there to break you, but to wake you? What if the ache you feel isn't a curse, but a compass? That feeling of being disconnected, unsettled, out of sync, it's not always a sign of failure. Sometimes it's the sacred signal of a soul that's been out of alignment with its purpose for too long. There comes a point in life where distraction stops working. The noise doesn't help. The achievements don't comfort. The applause doesn't heal, and the reason nothing satisfies is because you were never meant to live from the outside in. You were created to live from the inside out, fueled not by the opinions of man, but by the voice of the Spirit. So when your spirit gets quiet enough to speak, and the noise has finally faded, that emptiness you feel is not your undoing. It's your invitation. Your spirit knows where you're supposed to be, even when your mind forgets. There's a divine rhythm to your life, a purpose that God breathed into you before your first breath. And when you drift too far from that purpose, your spirit starts sounding the alarm, not with volume, but with emptiness. That's not failure, that's grace, because God will sometimes allow the things that once satisfied to lose their flavor, just to lead you back to what truly matters. You don't find your purpose in the comfort of the crowd. You find it in the classroom of emptiness. That place where you realize that success without significance is just noise. That activity without alignment is just movement without meaning. And that's when God begins to deal with you. Not to shame you, but to shape you. Not to push you down, but to pull you in. Because He knows that the only thing more dangerous than being empty is pretending you're full. Emptiness exposes what you've been using to cope instead of connect. It reveals the idols you've built to replace intimacy. It shows you what you've settled for, but it doesn't stop there. It also opens the door for restoration, because God never leaves you in the wilderness just to watch you suffer. He brings you there so you can hear Him without the interference. He strips away the extra so you can encounter the essential. Sometimes we pray for clarity, but what we need is consecration. Because when you're empty, you're finally in a position to be filled. When the bottle is empty, when the relationship falls apart, when the job doesn't satisfy, when everything you've relied on to define you stops working, that's when the real work begins. That's when God whispers, "Now I can show you who you really are. Now I can reveal what I've placed in you. Now I can pour into the places you've been pouring out without replenishment. The emptiness you feel is sacred space." Don't rush to fill it with substitutes. Don't numb it with distractions. Let it speak. Let it lead you back to the one who formed you with intention. That longing you feel in your quiet moments is not weakness. It's a signal that your spirit is craving connection with its Creator. And when you respond to that longing, when you return to the altar, when you surrender your striving and bow in stillness, God meets you there, not with condemnation, but with clarity. Purpose doesn't shout. It whispers, and sometimes God has to empty you of what you thought you needed so He can reveal what you were always called to do. Some of the greatest callings are born out of the deepest emptiness. Some of the most powerful anointings are discovered not on the mountaintop, but in the valley, because it's in that place of nothingness that God reminds you He's everything. He's the one who turns empty nets into overflowing abundance. He's the one who meets the widow at the bottom of her jar and multiplies it. He's the one who shows up when the wine runs out and turns water into something new. But He doesn't perform miracles where people are self-sufficient. He moves where there's space. He moves where there's room. And when your heart says, "God, I'm empty," He responds, "Now I can fill you with something eternal." Don't despise the season of emptiness. Don't curse the silence. There are things God will show you in the dry place that you'd never see in abundance. There are revelations that only come when the noise dies down and your soul becomes still enough to listen. Emptiness is not abandonment, it's not punishment, it's preparation. It's the space where God reintroduces you to who you really are. Without the filters, without the facade, without the fear, you're not lost, you're being led. You're not broken, you're being rebuilt. You're not finished, you're being refined. That hunger, that ache, that longing inside of you is not a sign that you've failed. It's a sign that something deeper is calling. And when you answer that call, when you stop running from the emptiness and start pressing into it, you'll find that what looked like the end was actually the beginning of something greater. Because when God fills you, He doesn't just patch the holes. He overflows, He anoints, He ignites, and suddenly the emptiness that once haunted you becomes the testimony that defines you. You realize that your greatest breakthrough didn't come when you were full, it came when you were empty enough to receive. Because emptiness is not your enemy, it's the echo of your spirit calling you back to divine purpose. You were never designed to be fulfilled by temporary things. Eternity is coded in your DNA. That gnawing sense that something is still missing. That subtle ache that shows up even after the goals are reached, the house is bought, the applause has died down. That's not dysfunction. That's design. Because God didn't wire you for this world, He built you for eternity. You weren't created to be satisfied by things that fade, crack, rust, or expire. And when you try to fill an eternal void with temporary pleasures, you'll always come up empty. This world is loud with promises. It promises that more money will bring peace, that another relationship will finally fix the loneliness, that climbing the next level, getting the next deal, earning the next title, that somehow all of it will complete you. But here's the truth. What's made of dust can never feed what's made of spirit. Your spirit comes from God and it craves God. You weren't created to live off of surface level success. You were created to walk in divine purpose. That's why every counterfeit leaves you craving something deeper. You can collect everything and still be empty. You can have a full life on paper, but a starved soul in practice. Because fulfillment doesn't come from what you possess, it comes from who you reflect. You were made in the image of a timeless God, which means no amount of temporary success will ever truly satisfy the deep waters of your spirit. That hunger in you, that's not because you're greedy, that's because you were made for glory. Eternity is not just your destination, it's your design. God planted something in you that this world cannot touch. That's why nothing in this life will ever be enough without Him. You can drink deeply from the well of this world and yet still thirst. But Jesus said, "Whoever drinks of the water I give will never thirst again." He wasn't talking about physical thirst. He was talking about that spiritual longing for something that's real, something that's lasting, something that doesn't change when the lights go off and the crowd goes home. When you chase what is fleeting, your joy will always be fragile. It will depend on circumstances, approval, the opinions of others, things that shift and shake. But when you live from the eternal, when you anchor yourself in what is unchanging, you begin to walk in a different kind of peace. A peace that is not shaken by loss. A purpose that is not moved by rejection. A joy that doesn't depend on good days to remain strong. The problem is, we've become addicted to the temporary. We've trained ourselves to be satisfied with shallow victories and momentary highs. We've taught ourselves that more is better, faster is success, louder is truth. But eternal things don't shout. They endure. They take root and grow over time. They don't just make you feel good, they make you whole. And that's what your soul is crying for. Not more noise, not more speed, but something that doesn't shift with the seasons, something that remains. God did not create you to chase shadows. He created you to carry light. That means you can't afford to keep giving your best energy to things that were never meant to satisfy. You can't keep offering your soul to the altar of achievement, hoping that one more win will make you feel worthy. Your worth was never meant to be earned, it was meant to be received. You don't have to strive to be seen when you understand you were created by the one who sees everything and still calls you his. That's why you feel restless when you settle for less than what he designed. That's why the relationship that looks good may still feel wrong. That's why the success that impressed others didn't impress your spirit. You were designed for more, not more stuff, but more depth. Not more approval, but more alignment. Not more attention, but more anointing. And all of that comes when you step out of the cycle of chasing the temporary and surrender to the one who is eternal. The reason you can't shake the feeling that there's more to life is because there is more. But it's not found in striving, it's found in surrender. It's not found in addition, it's found in alignment. And when you come into alignment with the eternal purpose God placed inside of you, everything begins to shift. Your desires change, your values change. What used to satisfy you no longer appeals to you because your soul begins to crave what it was built for, communion with the eternal. You weren't made to be owned by your possessions. You weren't made to be crushed by your performance. You weren't made to be defined by your past. You were made for more, more than this world can offer, more than this culture can sell, more than the temporary highs that disappear by morning. You were made for a peace that remains, a joy that endures, a love that never fails. You were made for eternity. And the beautiful truth is this, that eternity is already living in you. When you said yes to Jesus, eternity took up residence in your soul. You don't have to wait until heaven to experience the presence of God. You can live in that now. You can walk in that power now. You can operate in that purpose now. But it requires a shift from feeding the flesh to feeding the spirit. A shift from chasing the moment to seeking the eternal. A shift from living for the applause of man to living from the approval of God. This world will always try to define you by what is temporary, your job, your title, your income, your image. But God defines you by what is eternal, your identity in Christ, your calling, your purpose, your destiny. And when you finally stop looking around and start looking above, you'll discover that everything you were trying to find out, there is already available in Him. Because you were never designed to be fulfilled by temporary things, eternity is coded in your DNA. Real satisfaction comes not when you get more, but when you surrender deeper. That's when God fills the void. We live in a world that teaches us to reach for more money, more success, more applause, more control. And yet, with all the getting, we still feel empty. With all the chasing, we still feel tired. The soul doesn't rest in accumulation, it rests in surrender. You can climb every ladder the world offers, but if your heart hasn't bowed before the throne of grace, you'll still find yourself hollow at the top. Real fulfillment does not come from the height you reach, but from the depth you release. God is not impressed by how much you gather, He's drawn to how much you give up. Not the giving up that comes from defeat, but the surrender that flows from trust. It's when we open our hands and unclench our hearts that God finally has room to pour in His peace, His power, His provision. You were never meant to carry everything, you were meant to yield. And when you yield, you tap into the supernatural supply of a God who knows no lack. We've confused striving with strength, but strength in the kingdom doesn't look like more hustle, it looks like deeper humility. It's when you fall to your knees that heaven stands up on your behalf. The world tells you to push harder, but the Spirit calls you to trust deeper, and it's in that deeper trust where real transformation happens. Because God doesn't fill the proud, He fills the surrendered, and when you make space, He brings substance. When you let go, He lifts up. When you decrease, He increases. You see, it's easy to think more will fix the ache. More recognition, more status, more activity. But the ache is spiritual, not material. and you can't solve a spiritual hunger with physical means. That's why you can be surrounded by blessings and still feel burdened. It's not about how much you have, it's about how much you've handed over to God. He's not after your schedule, he's after your surrender. He's not looking at your achievements, he's looking at your alignment. And when your heart aligns with his will, when you lay down your desires at his feet, something miraculous happens. The emptiness begins to lift. The void begins to fill, not with noise, but with peace. Not with pressure, but with purpose. Because the void in you was shaped for the presence of God, and nothing else can satisfy it. Not relationships, not success, not even ministry. Until he fills it, it will remain hollow. Some of us are tired not because we're doing too little, but because we're trying to do too much without surrender, carrying burdens God never asked us to carry, forcing outcomes he never called us to control, fighting battles he's already won. But when you surrender, truly surrender, you stop striving and start resting. You stop managing outcomes and start trusting God with the outcome. You stop building castles of self and start building altars of worship. There's a divine exchange that happens in surrender. You give God your anxiety and he gives you his peace. You give him your weakness and he gives you his strength. You give him your confusion and he gives you his clarity. But that exchange can't happen until you lay it down. God will not force his peace into a place you refuse to open. That's why surrender isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's not giving up, it's giving over. We often think surrender is a one-time decision, but the truth is, it's a daily posture. Every morning your soul must decide, will I chase more or will I trust more? Will I cling or will I release? Will I control or will I surrender? And it's in the surrender that strength rises, the kind of strength that isn't shaken by storms, the kind of peace that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances, the kind of joy that flows even in dry places. God is not just calling you to a higher life, he's calling you to a deeper one. Not one built on platforms, but one rooted in his presence. And the deeper you go into surrender, the fuller your life becomes. Because God does not fill prideful temples, he inhabits broken vessels. He chooses those who make room for him, and every time you say, God, I can't do this without you, heaven moves closer. Every time you surrender your plan, God releases his. And his plan always exceeds what you thought you needed. So many lie exhausted because they're trying to run their life like a business instead of offering it like a sacrifice. But a surrendered life is not a diminished life, it's an empowered one. Because what you give up for God, he multiplies. What you lose in your hands, he increases in his. That's the secret. Real satisfaction doesn't come when you have more, it comes when you trust more. It doesn't come when life is perfect, it comes when your heart is in position. That's why the widow who gave 2 mites had more joy than the rich man who gave from his overflow. That's why Paul, beaten and imprisoned, could write, I have learned the secret of being content. Because surrender leads to supernatural contentment. It doesn't mean you don't dream. It doesn't mean you don't plan. It means you trust that God's timing, God's ways, and God's outcomes are better than anything you could ever orchestrate. And when you reach that place, when you stop clenching and start releasing, you begin to live in rhythm with heaven. You stop fearing the future and start flowing in faith. You stop measuring success by results and start measuring it by obedience. And that's when real satisfaction shows up. Not the fleeting thrill of another achievement, but the deep, lasting joy of walking with God in peace. That kind of fulfillment can't be bought, borrowed, or built. It's received through surrender, because real satisfaction comes not when you get more, but when you surrender deeper. That's when God fills the void. If this word stirred your spirit, don't just keep it, share it. Like this video, subscribe for more kingdom, aligned revelation, and turn on the bell because heaven is always speaking. Until next time, walk strong, live surrendered, and let God fill the void. Stay blessed.